I want you to think about what I'm about to say now. Every person you've ever met has told you exactly who they are. Not necessarily through the big, deliberate conversations, not through the things they sat down and decided to share with you intentionally, but through the small, casual, unguarded moments, the throwaway comments, the opinions they express without thinking twice, the way they talk about things when they're relaxed enough to stop performing and just speak freely. And this is especially true when it comes to how someone relates to intimacy. Because intimacy is one of those areas where a person's real mindset, their real history, their real relationship with connection and vulnerability. It surfaces in language in ways that are genuinely difficult to hide if you know what you're listening for. Not because people are trying to deceive you, but because our experiences shape our perspective so deeply that they eventually just start coming out of our mouths naturally, without any announcement. So today, I'm going to be talking about 5 things women say casually that reveal a lot about their relationship with intimacy, and by extension, about their experience with it. And before we go any further, I want to be clear about something, because the framing of this conversation matters. This is not about shaming anyone. This doesn't automatically make her a bad partner or a bad person. What it does is give you useful information about her mindset, how she thinks about connection, what intimacy means to her, and whether that aligns with what you're actually looking for. Let's get into it. Number 1. Sex is just sex. It's not that deep. This one tends to come up casually, almost offhandedly, usually in a conversation about relationships or dating, where she's making a point about being relaxed and unbothered. And on the surface, it can sound like confidence, like a woman who's comfortable with herself and doesn't attach unnecessary weight to things. But there's something worth understanding about what this particular mindset actually reveals when you look at it closely. For most women, intimacy is not naturally a purely physical experience. There's an emotional dimension to it that exists almost regardless of intention, something that connects the physical act to feeling, to vulnerability, to a sense of closeness that goes beyond the moment itself. This is not a universal rule, and there are always exceptions, but it is a pattern that's consistent enough to be worth paying attention to. What that means is that the ability to genuinely separate the emotional from the physical, to arrive at a place where intimacy is truly just a physical transaction with no emotional weight attached, is not a starting point. It's a destination, and it's one that's reached through a significant amount of experience. The kind of experience that gradually trains the emotional response out of the equation until the physical can exist entirely on its own. So when a woman tells you casually that sex is nothing, that it's not that deep, that she doesn't understand why people make such a big deal of it, she's not necessarily being dishonest. She might be telling you something completely true about where she currently is. But where she currently is didn't happen overnight. That level of emotional detachment from intimacy develops over time, through repeated experience, and it tends to reflect a history that is more extensive than the casual delivery of the statement might suggest. Number 2. Most men don't really know what they're doing in bed. This one is worth paying close attention to because of the specific word sitting right in the middle of it. Most. Not some, not a couple. Most. And that word is doing a tremendous amount of work in that sentence, whether she realizes it or not, because most is a comparative statement. It implies a sample size large enough to establish a pattern, large enough to draw a conclusion that extends across a majority, rather than just a handful of isolated experiences. Think about it this way. If someone tells you that most restaurants in a city have disappointing service, your immediate assumption is that this person has eaten at enough restaurants in that city to have formed a reliable opinion. You don't assume they visited 2 or 3 and reached that conclusion. The word most carries an implied quantity with it, and that implied quantity is significant. When a woman makes this statement in casual conversation, not angrily, not as part of a complaint, but just as a relaxed observation about her experience, she's revealing something about the breadth of that experience without intending to. Because in order to confidently conclude that most men fall short in this area, she would need a reference pool substantial enough to establish what most actually looks like. 2 or 3 experiences don't produce that kind of conclusion. A pattern does, and patterns require volume. There's also something worth noticing about the confidence with which this statement tends to get made. It's rarely hesitant or qualified. It comes out easily, casually, like an established fact she stopped questioning a long time ago. And that ease is itself informative. It tells you that this conclusion was reached a while back, that it's been sitting comfortably in her perspective long enough to feel like settled truth rather than a fresh observation. None of this makes her a bad person, but it does tell you something real about the depth of her experience, far more clearly than a direct question ever would. 3. I don't get attached easily. This one sounds like self-awareness when you first hear it. It sounds like a woman who knows herself, who has a healthy relationship with her own emotions, who isn't going to fall apart over a situationship or get clingy after a single good date. And presented that way, it can actually seem like an attractive quality, someone emotionally grounded and secure enough to keep things in perspective. But there's a difference between emotional maturity and emotional detachment. And understanding that difference is what makes this particular phrase worth paying attention to. Emotional maturity looks like a woman who feels things genuinely, but has developed the wisdom and self-awareness to process those feelings without being controlled by them. Emotional detachment looks like a woman who has been through enough that the feelings themselves have largely stopped showing up in the first place. One is growth. The other is a kind of protective numbness that develops through repeated experience. A defense mechanism the emotional system builds gradually when it has been exposed to enough cycles of connection and disconnection that it eventually stops investing fully in either. Let me give you a practical example of how this can actually play out. Imagine you've been seeing this woman for a few weeks. Things have been genuinely good, real conversations, real chemistry, consistent time together. And then something comes up where you have to pull back briefly, maybe a work situation, maybe just a busy week. For most women in that early stage, some degree of wondering, some slight emotional response to the distance would be completely natural. But she doesn't miss a beat. She's completely unbothered. No reaction, no adjustment in her energy, nothing. And when you mention it, she just shrugs and says, "Honestly, I don't really get attached that quickly." That absence of response, in a moment where a natural response would be expected, is the signal. Because not getting attached easily isn't something most people are born with. It's something that gets practiced into existence, one experience at a time, until the emotional wiring simply stops firing the way it used to. Number 4. I've pretty much seen it all. This one usually surfaces in a particular kind of conversation, the early dating stage where things are getting a little flirtatious, where a man is starting to hint at what he brings to the table, and she responds with an energy that is almost impossible to ruffle. You're suggesting, directly or indirectly, that you're going to show her something worth experiencing. And she smiles, maybe laughs a little, and says something along the lines of, "I've pretty much seen it all at this point." Now, before we talk about what that statement reveals about her, I want to say something honest about what it reveals about the men who came before you. Because this is actually a two-sided conversation, and I think the male side of it deserves some accountability. A significant reason why so many women arrive at this particular place, this been there, done that, nothing surprises me anymore energy, is because so many men have approached intimacy as a performance rather than a genuine experience. More focused on what they want her to think about them than on what she's actually feeling. More invested in their own ego than in real connection. And when that's the pattern a woman has encountered repeatedly, across enough experiences to constitute her entire reference point for what intimacy looks like, Of course she becomes unimpressible. Of course nothing feels new. She hasn't been shown anything genuinely different. She's been shown variations of the same self-centered performance wearing different costumes. So yes, this statement tells you something about the volume of her experience, but it also tells you something about the quality of what that experience actually contained. And honestly, men collectively share some responsibility for that. That said, what this phrase reveals practically is significant. When a woman genuinely means it, when she says it with that particular calm certainty rather than as playful banter, it tells you that her baseline has been set by a level of experience that goes well beyond what most people would consider average. She's not easily impressed because she's had more than enough opportunity to develop the comparison points necessary to know the difference. Lastly, we have at number 5. If the chemistry is right, why not? This one tends to come up when the conversation turns to standards around intimacy. Usually something like whether she'd move quickly with someone she just met, or what it takes for her to feel ready to take things to a physical level. And when the answer is essentially, if it feels right, if there's a connection, if the energy is there, it sounds open-minded and spontaneous on the surface. But there's something underneath that answer worth examining honestly. Chemistry is one of the most subjective, easily triggered feelings in early human interaction. It's a smile across a room. It's a conversation that flows without effort. It's eye contact that lingers a second longer than expected. It's the feeling of being slightly drawn to someone without being able to fully articulate why. And these feelings, real as they are not rare. They happen frequently, with more people than most of us would comfortably admit, in more situations than we'd like to think. So when chemistry becomes the primary threshold for physical intimacy, when the bar is essentially I felt something so I acted on it, what that reflects is a relationship with intimacy that is primarily governed by feeling in the moment, rather than by any deeper standard of connection, trust, or time. And arriving at that place, being genuinely comfortable with that as a consistent operating principle, requires a certain level of familiarity with the process. It requires having done it enough times that the decision no longer carries the weight it once did. This doesn't make her reckless or irresponsible. People make their own choices, and those choices belong to them. But what it does tell you is something important about how she's likely to approach intimacy within whatever dynamic you're building with her, and whether that approach aligns with what you're actually looking for in a partner. That brings me to something I want to leave you with before we close today, is that none of these 5 phrases are automatic disqualifiers. None of them tell you that the woman saying them is not worth your time, not capable of genuine love, not someone you could build something real with. What they tell you is something more nuanced than that. They give you a window into her relationship with intimacy, her emotional wiring around connection, and the experiences that shaped both of those things. What you do with that information is entirely your decision. But the most grounded version of that decision comes not from obsessing over her past or fixating on numbers. It comes from paying attention to her values, her consistency, her character, and how she shows up for you in the present. The past is information. It's useful information. But it's the person standing in front of you right now and the mindset she brings into your dynamic today that actually determines whether something real is possible between you. Drop a comment below and let me know. Does a woman's past actually factor into how you approach dating her? I read every single comment, and this is genuinely one of those conversations where I'd love to hear where you actually stand. If this gave you a clearer way of reading between the lines in dating, a like helps this channel reach the men who need it most. And if you're not subscribed yet, come join us. We go deep on this every single week. I'll see you in the next one.